Okay, welcome back. We're on page 163 talking about backup types. So SQL Server has three backup types. A full backup, which sounds inappropriate because the full backup does not back up everything. The full backup backs up the data part. Remember we talked about how you have the honest to God saved current data, and then you have like a history of everything that happened. Okay, so one is the data file, one is the log file. The full only backs up the data file. Okay, it does not back up all the historical things that happened in the past. Okay, and then there's one called the differential backup. So differential is just like, well, I don't have to back up the entire data file. I only back up the parts that have changed since the last time I did a backup. So it'll speed things up. Okay, so if you were to do a full backup every time, well, then it would take, I don't know, let's say 30 minutes to do. But using differential, maybe it'll take 10 minutes. On the first one, the full will still take 30 minutes. But subsequent differentials could take 10 minutes, and it might speed things up. Okay? So far, so good. So both full and differential only back up the data portions of it. They do not back up the historical portion in the log file. And then there's one called a transaction log backup. And the only thing it does is back up the historical transaction thing. Okay. All right. So remember how back up to here we have talked about this? And here's the log file. And I'm going to scoot over here. We get to see the name of the file. Okay. So the data file is called MDF. And the log file is called LDF. Okay. Those are the file names that are being used. So it starts out being so much size, and then you can set it to automatically grow in length. So this guy is going to basically, the database file, it's going to automatically kind of grow and shrink on its own without too much effort. The log file, unfortunately, is going to remember everything you have ever done to the database from the beginning of time. And if you don't do log file maintenance on it, the log file will consume every spot of disk space on your entire server. So it's critically important to understand what makes that log file shrink. It actually doesn't shrink. What happens is it rolls over. In other words, it's this big, and then you do what's called a log file backup. And what it basically does, it just goes back and rolls over. It starts using the older spots of the disk. Okay? So you could have a log file of a fixed size, and when you do a log file backup, it rolls over and starts over again. So the log file doesn't actually grow in size anymore. If you forget to do a log file backup, your machine will run out of disk space. It won't take very long either, because you're recording absolutely everything that happens to the machine. Okay, good. Okay, the next thing we're going to have to do is learn how to attach and detach a database. This is something that's critically important that you're going to need to learn to do for your term project, because you're going to be building a database and you're going to be detaching it and then shipping it off to me, okay, as part of the assignment. So this is critically important that you understand how this thing works. Good, okay. So the first question is, where the heck are the files stored? Okay, well, let's go take a peek, because we've already looked at this. If I bring up this and go to files, it gives me the location. And it is just this long thing. Program files, blah, 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 data. Okay, so that's the first thing we need to know. And I already told you which one is the data file. Because when we do a detach, I don't particularly want the log file, because first of all, I'm assuming that when you create your database for your term project, it's going to automatically pick the simple recovery model, which basically says, I don't really need a log file, so I'm not asking you to turn in two files. I'm asking you just to turn in one. Okay, so let's go to that location and see if we can find this thing. So I'm going to start with going to the C drive. I'm going to go to Program Files. I'm going to go to SQL Server. I'm going to go to the Express Edition. I'm going to go SQL. And I'm going to go Data. That's the first hurdle we get, is this comes up and says, you don't have the right permissions. I go, okay, fine. So I'll hit this little button, and now I do have permission. Great. The next thing we're going to do is I'm just going to copy the Cape Cod file. So I'm just going to say copy and go up here and just dumping them on my desktop. What do you think? So I'm just going to do paste. And it says you need permission. Go right ahead. and then it says you can't do this because the file is in use. Okay, that's something that we need to fix. And the way you fix that is by going in and detaching the database. Okay, so I'm going to go to my guy. I'm going to go to Cape Cod. I'm going to do a right click, and if I go to tasks, one of the things is detach. So I do detach, and then it says, do you want to drop all connections and update statistics? I often do that just for the heck of it. So now it's detached. So let's try that again. Let me go down to this guy where the data is. I'm going to grab Cape Cod. I'm going to do copy. I'm going to go back to the desktop. I'm going to do paste. And ta-da! This time it worked. We just learned how to detach a database. Now let's see if we can figure out how to put it back. So it's pretty straightforward. One of the ones is attach. And if I go through here and I can say I'd like to reattach that guy, it's going to pick some stuff for me. I hit the button and presto changeo, Cape Cod is back. Yay! Okay, one more time. You need to go to the location, grant yourself permissions because it's not going to be there. You're going to have to go in and detach the database, then copy it, and then, optionally go back and reattach the database afterwards. Okay, you're going to need to know this when it comes time for the term project. Good, okay. Let's talk about indexes one more time. So one more time, what does indexes do? It speeds up the searches, primarily where clause. So how do you apply indexes? Well, you could manually go in here and say, I know what I'm doing. I'm going to do this. That's probably not the right way. So if you go here, there's actually a cool thing when we get here. It's called the Database Engine Tuning Wizard. Okay? And what this guy will do, first of all, use this thing called a profiler. Here's a typical scenario. Let's say I have a database and I've got it populated and it's running kind of slow and I want to figure out what's going on. And so for like an entire day, I'll turn the profiler on and record everything that happens to the database for 24 hours. And then I come in the next day and I turn off the profile. Now I have a list of everything that's happened. And then I go to this database tuning advisor, give it that profile, and it will go through and try out every single thing you can think of. It'll say, what happens if you put an index here? Ooh, that made it worse. What happens if you put an index here? Ooh, that made it a little bit better. What happens if you put an index over here? And so it just tries these permutations, every conceivable permutation. It runs through and says, okay, here's what I think you ought to do. You ought to change this to a clustered or non-clustered. We need to add one over here or delete one over there. Because you remember, sometimes you might want to, let's say you have a table that gets inserted an awful lot. I mean, an awful lot. Maybe that default of using a clustered index on the primary key is not a good idea because it might actually slow things down. So the database engine tuning wizard can basically tell this for you because, okay, I'm going to go ahead and say this out loud. You ain't that smart, okay? Let the machine do it. That's what the artificial intelligence is all about. Don't do this by hand. That's dumb. Okay, one more time. Where do I find the indexes? So the index for under artist is under indexes is under each one of the tables, okay? Right? Because they belong to the tables. Here's an interesting thing. It is very common, for example, that the size of the table could be this big, and then the size of if you had multiple indexes on that table, the size of the indexes could actually be larger. I'm talking about stuff on disk, stored in the database itself. Could be that the indexes are actually larger than the data. That's actually fairly common because lots of tables have indexes. Okay, so next thing we're going to talk about is viewing the locks and activities. So if I want to see what's going on in a database, there's this cool thing called a stored procedure called who. And there's two versions of it. So this is the later version, SP-who. And basically it's going to tell me the activities, who the login is and what's going on in the database. And here's things that are happening on master. And here's something happening on VRG. and this process is basically sleeping. And so there's a cool thing, blocked by. So this will tell me that I have a process that's hanging, waiting for something else to occur, some lock to occur or to be released. So SP who is a very good way of looking at, do I have a lock out there? And let's just pretend like this, I'm making this up. So that particular thing is causing me problems because it's the one locking. Well, I can actually go in here and whack that particular process ID number 53 if I wanted to. Okay. So there's a thing called an activity monitor, which basically is the same thing. So the activity monitor over here basically gives you some cool stuff about, the processes and which ones are waiting on things and, how much activity there's going on. So this is a really cool way of looking at all the things that are happening in your database. Okay. So let's say I wanted to know a little bit about what's happening, how the database is configured. There's a thing called DBCC, which I think stands for Database Command. I don't know. It could be. I'm not absolutely certain. But one of the things you can do is one called User Options. And basically what this is going to do is going to tell you, here's the language I'm using and the date format and blah, 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 blah. And the isolation level. Remember we talked about the isolation level? Okay, one of the things we kind of danced around a bit. Remember when I told you that when it comes time to copy a file that has an auto number in it, copy a table that has an auto number in it, there's a thing called identity insert, which you could just set identity insert to true or on, and then it'll allow you to insert into an identity column without having to go through that thing. I typically don't do that. I don't do, set identity insert students on. I don't normally do that because, quite frankly, it's not universal. And so if you learned how to do it this way, when you go to a different system like MySQL, you'll be going, hey, how come this don't work? Well, okay. All right, let's do a quick review since we made it through most of the topics here. Creating views. Why do I create a view? Well, because I want to persist a query. I don't have to write the query every single time. Because if it's a complex query, I just want to write it once. Because maybe I'm very good at writing queries, but Bob over there, he's not. So I write all the queries for him so he can use it. Okay? So that's how they're different from just, typing. Okay. How are they used? Well, you just pretend like they're a table. Remember? I just say select asterisk from, whatever the view name is. Okay? Where are they stored physically? So this is a little weird. Views have their own little thing here, right? That's where you put your views under VRG. But when it comes to functions and stored procedures, they're under a thing called programmability, and they separate them out. They have table-driven functions and scalar functions. They make a distinction between those two. Okay, just saying. That's where those things go. So why would I create a function? So what was the most fundamental difference between a function and a table-driven view? If they both return tables, what's the significant difference? It's passing a parameter. Okay, that'd be a good one. Stored procedures, I'm not asking you to build one, but I could ask you, what are they typically used for? Good. And the fact that I could have the stored procedure permissions different than the underlying tables. I could give you no permission whatsoever on the employee table, but give you read and write permission on the stored procedure, and that'll grant you what you need to be able to go into the employee table and make changes. So that's pretty cool. All right. Transactions. Remember, the whole point of a transaction is all or nothing. And so if it's just a single command, that's pretty easy. But if I'm doing two updates, one right after the other, one update where I'm removing $100 from your account, another update immediately underneath it where I'm adding $100 to somebody else's account. I want to bundle those two together so they all or nothing. Either they both work or they both fail, not one in one. Okay, kind of makes sense? Okay, that's a quick review of all those things and where they physically fit in here. And I'll see you guys in the next video.